Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook, and with me today is Dr. Wendy Suzuki, who runs an interactive research lab at NYU, where her work has been recognized with numerous awards, including the prestigious Troland Research Award from the National Academy of Sciences. Her research is focused on understanding the patterns of brain activity underlying long-term memory, and more recently, how aerobic exercise might improve our learning, memory, and cognitive abilities. She's a two-time TED speaker and TED Talk speaker, and is regularly interviewed on television and print about her work on the effects of exercise on brain function. She lectures nationally and internationally on her research and serves as a reviewer for many top neuroscience journals. She lives in New York City and lives a great life there, according to her book. Dr. Suzuki, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, John.
This is great. We had a while back, we had Dr. Norman Doidge, who is a psychoanalyst that's written a couple of books on the neuroplasticity of the brain. Mm-hmm. And in his work, he talked about for example, a guy who taught himself how to walk properly, even though he had Parkinson's, some ways in which they're using cool lasers to use the neuroplasticity of the brain for healing, meditation and Buddhism and its effect on brain healing. And your book touches on this in a very unique way, in that your own research has been applied to your life. In fact, I'm going to take from the final note: I've shared with you the most meaningful insights from an ongoing experiment with my own brain plasticity. And that's sort of the theme of Healthy Brain, Happy Life, which is our book for today.
Absolutely. I mean, that's you've hit on the core of the message. And what I really wanted to try and do is share with people really practical neuroscience. You're not going to get a PhD in neuroscience, but what you're going to learn from the book is clear and hopefully very easy to understand concepts, so that you can take advantage of the kinds of brain improvements that you can do every day and you can experience every day through exercise, through meditation, through decreases of stress, and how that works and why that works, to provide more of a motivation, but also just a deeper understanding of brain plasticity and how we can take advantage of our brains.
Yeah, it's marvelous in that regard, and I appreciated it as I connected things in my own life to what you know and have studied about the brain. The subtitle, A Personal Program to Activate Your Brain and Do Everything Better, is really a good subtitle. But let's start at the beginning.
Yeah.
You were a geeky girl.
Yes.
Let's talk about that for just a minute. The history of your life is that you discovered that you wanted to become a scientist fairly early in life.
Yes, I mean, I was interested in science, and I was good in math and science in school, but there was a very clear moment when I realized I wanted to be a scientist, and specifically a neuroscientist, and that was the first semester of my freshman year at UC Berkeley, when I took a class called The Brain and Its Potential taught by amazing professor Marion Diamond. And she showed me the human brain, a real preserved human brain for the first time, and told me about her groundbreaking experiments in the 1960s, in which she was one of the very first scientists to show that the adult brain can actually change in response to the environment. And she did that by basically maxing out the positive stimulation that the rats were getting by raising them in what she called an enriched environment with lots of toys and lots of space and lots of other rats. I describe it as the Disney World of environments. Mm-hmm. And she compared the brains of those rats to rats that were raised in what they called impoverished environments with no toys and just a couple of other rats around in a smaller space. Mm-hmm. What she showed, which was so revolutionary, is that the actual anatomical structure of the brain's outer covering, called the cortex, got thicker. The brain got bigger when you raised rats in enriched environments. And that was due to more connections being formed, more glia cells or support cells, and as well as more blood vessels being stimulated to be formed in the rats raised in Disney World. And that was a huge change in the field, which at the time thought no change in the adult brain after adulthood has been reached. And when I learned about that and brain plasticity, I said to myself, literally, after that first class, that's what I want to study. That's the coolest thing I've ever heard.
Yes, and it's nice that your mentor, Dr. Diamond, is one of the people that advocates for this book as a contribution to helping society enjoy the magnificence of their brain. Yes. And she obviously was very influential and inspirational to you.
Yes, absolutely.
And you started this book with her class, and you talked about the brain and its parts. Can we sort of go through? I know there's a lot of parts we're going to address in here, but just the basic parts of the brain: the frontal lobe, the seat of personality. What is there? The prefrontal cortex. What is that?
Yeah,
about?
There's so much happening in the prefrontal cortex. It is involved in helping you make decisions. It's involved in kind of defining your personality. Your personality changes if you have damage to your prefrontal cortex. It's involved in what's called working memory, which is that memory that allows you to keep things in mind, not over long term, but just during the course of a conversation. And it's very much involved in attention, being able to focus your attention and shift your attention. So many what we call higher cognitive functions are dependent on this prefrontal cortex, which is located right behind your forehead in the brain. Another brain area that I talk about a lot is located in the temporal lobe, which is kind of behind your ear, or right below your ear, I should say. And deep in the heart of that temporal lobe is a structure that's critical for long-term memory, and that structure is called the hippocampus. We have two hippocampi, one on the right side and one on the left side. And if you damage your hippocampi on both sides, you become what we call densely amnesic. You are not able to form any new long-term memories after the point in time that your hippocampi were damaged. But you maintain your ability to recall the memories that you had already laid down before the damage.
And they wind up residing somewhere else,
yes,
ultimately, even though the hippocampus generates. And it's also responsible for mood and imagination, you say.
Yes, exactly. So mood, both imagination and mood are functions that are much more recently attributed to the hippocampus. So we know that the hippocampus and a function that I talk about a lot in this book, which is the birth of new brain cells in the hippocampus. That's called hippocampal neurogenesis. That is very much involved in mood. Because if you're not able to generate new hippocampal cells, your actually antidepressants do not work to improve your mood. So you need these new hippocampal cells to be able to kind of lift your mood up. And even more recently than that, there are studies showing that people with damage to the hippocampus, they're called certainly have memory problems. That's not a surprise to anybody. But recently, it's been appreciated that these patients also have a very difficult time imagining new, unexperienced situations. So imagining a tropical beach if you haven't been to a tropical beach. And that suggests that the hippocampus is not only important for putting together, information in your memory from your past, but maybe putting them together in new ways to imagine things in the future. And that kind of imagination is critical for creativity.
And I remember the example you gave of two patients, one who did not have damage, and the thoroughness of his images, even though he'd never been to a tropical beach, and the other one was just kind of, well, it's hot and the sky is blue, and that's
right.
So.
Exactly. Very, very minimal. And that's important to understand that that's not a language deficit. These patients have perfectly normal language capacity. They just can't generate the image of this novel situation that they've never experienced before. So that's really fascinating, and that's one of the hypotheses that I'm fascinated with and I'm exploring in my lab. That is, one thing we know that improves hippocampal function is exercise. So exercise can actually enhance the birth of brand new brain cells in your hippocampus. I call that hippocampal neurogenesis. And the hypothesis is that is not only improving your long-term memory, but may also be improving your imagination and thereby your creativity.
And I do want to talk at length about how you've implemented exercise into your research and teaching, but I don't want to miss out on the amygdala, my personal favorite part.
Yes.
I'm talking a lot about that in my classes in communication because of its connection to emotion, and especially when the sense of smell is involved.
Right.
And that's of interest to me. And then the striatum is a little bit, we ought to address that too in terms of the reward system. So
Sure. So the amygdala is, amygdala means almond. It's kind of an almond-shaped structure that sits right in front of the hippocampus. It's much smaller than the hippocampus, and we know that it's very much involved in processing emotion. We know the most about the role of the amygdala in fear. But we also know that the amygdala is critical in working together with the hippocampus, because we know that one of the things that makes events particularly memorable is if they have emotional resonance. You can imagine, I mean, we know that we remember the happiest and the saddest moments of our entire life, and that's because those key emotional times help, through the amygdala, help strengthen the memories that are being formed by the hippocampus. So they work together very strongly in helping to kind of create our own personal histories that are full of, again, these happiest and saddest moments of our lives.
And then our habit-forming part, the striatum, is important to reward systems and even how addictions develop. And so,
absolutely. That is a fascinating part of the brain where it's the seed of the neurotransmitter dopamine, important for reward. So when you win the lottery, your dopamine really goes up, spikes up in your brain. When you have a delicious meal or you do something that you really love to do, that's when dopamine is surging. And that dopamine is being processed largely through this structure that you mentioned, the striatum. It's important for reward. It's also important for initiating movement. This is the structure where we know that if when the dopamine system gets damaged, you have Parkinson's disease, and you're not able to initiate new movement. So it's this interesting kind of combination of both reward and movement generation, because in fact reward helps you direct your movements. What are you going to physically do? You go search out reward. So it's linked to a main topic that I talk about in the book, which is exercise, because exercise is another function that can enhance dopamine release. And I should also say that dopamine is but is the key system that drugs of abuse target. So heroin and cocaine, what they are doing is they give you that high, and you're so addicted to them because they are artificially ratcheting up the release of dopamine to levels that you never experience in normal situations. And you're getting this surge of your natural reward neurotransmitter. And that's why those drugs become so addictive, is that you've never felt anything, never felt as good as that, and you want to get that back again and again.
Right.
And so that's it's a fascinating system.
And there are two others that stimulate that we ought to mention, that are mentioned in the book, are nicotine and sugar.
Yes.
Which is an interesting one that brings out the pleasure response, right?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, many of us who enjoy desserts, and I'm certainly one of them, recognize that pleasure that comes from a beautifully made dessert. But also nicotine, which is also very highly addictive as well. So most of these very addictive drugs are infiltrating the dopamine system in one way or another.
I wanted to mention something about the brain structure and its impact on certain kinds of learning and memory, because you mentioned particularly the London taxi cab driver and also doormen in New York. And they each have special stories that it would be good to share.
Yeah, sure. So one of my favorite findings in all of neuroscience is one that was done by a colleague of mine, Eleanor Maguire. She's at University College London. And she did, so I told you about the experiments in rats where they raised them in enriched environments and they showed that the brain changes. Well, you and I live in enriched environments, and Eleanor did a very clever experiment. She asked whether the brains of people that do a particularly challenging job might change their brain. And the challenging job that she looked at are London taxicab drivers. So to get certified to become a London taxicab driver, you have to go through several years of training and memorization, and you have to take a test called the knowledge. And many people fail this test. And so what she did is she said, well, the people that passed not only studied so much, but they had this enormous knowledge of the hundreds and thousands of streets in London. And what she did, she compared the brain structure of London taxicab drivers compared to age and education-matched control subjects. And she found that London taxicab drivers had larger posterior hippocampi, again, the structure important for memory, but particularly important for spatial memory compared to control subjects. So that was an amazing finding. But then she went on to show that you can argue that, well, maybe these London taxicab drivers were just born with a bigger hippocampus. That's not so interesting. Can you show that the hippocampus actually changes when you successfully learn this information? So she set off on yet another study in which she followed wannabe London taxicab drivers through their 2 years of training. And she scanned their brains at the beginning of training and then followed them all the way through. And then she got two different groups, one that passed the knowledge test and they became successful London taxicab drivers, and the other half failed the test. At the end of that time point, when she knew who had passed and who had failed, she scanned them again. And what she found was the posterior hippocampi of the London taxicab drivers that passed was not only bigger than before they studied all of this, but it was significantly larger at the end of the study than the wannabe London taxicab drivers that failed the test. Mm-hmm. So that was an even more clear demonstration of brain plasticity, the growth of a structure important for spatial learning and memory in the group that successfully passed and did better on this test. Mm-hmm. And that is just one of my favorite examples of brain plasticity. Anybody has this. So if you play the piano, if you're a musician, you've changed your brain. If you bowl a lot and you're good at bowling, you've changed your brain from all of that activity. But the London taxicab drivers is just a wonderful, clever example that she was able to do. And the other example that you mentioned was the Dormant Experiment, which was my follow-up, my thought experiment. I haven't done this experiment, but it was just an experiment stimulated and inspired by the London taxicab experiment, which is doormen in New York have, in the biggest buildings, hundreds of faces that they have to recognize. And they have a very important job. They have to keep out the non-residents and allow the residents through and greet them like they're friends and be very friendly to them. But that is very hard with hundreds of people and kids and all the different residents. And so that suggested to me that the successful New York City doormen that are working in the biggest buildings must have larger brain areas involved in processing facial features. And we know where those brain areas are. They are in the visual part of the brain. And this is the part of the brain that we know is damaged in patients with what we call prosopagnosia, when you cannot recognize any faces.
Yeah, you mentioned Brad Pitt has that condition.
Yes,
right?
So apparently the actor Brad Pitt has prosopagnosia. The famous artist Chuck Close, who ironically paints large portraits of faces, has prosopagnosia. He cannot recognize people, including his wife, just by looking at their face. He uses other clues, of course, voice, hair, clothes style, but not from their face. Yet he's famous for his amazingly beautiful portraits, huge portraits of faces. So my experiment is image the face area of New York City doormen that work in the largest buildings compared to perhaps New York City more doormen that work in very small buildings, where they have to do the same job, but they just don't have as many faces that they have to recognize. And my prediction is the face area in the doormen that are working in the largest buildings will be larger and perhaps activated in a more robust way when viewing faces compared to the doormen that are working in the smaller buildings. Mm-hmm. And hopefully one day I'll be able to do that study.
Let's talk briefly about the mysteries of memory and how that famous patient H.M.,
yes,
who had serious damage to his brain, was instrumental in people learning more about the different kinds of memory.
Yeah. This is probably the most famous patient in neurology ever studied. And this man, his name was Henry Mollison. He passed away. He, when he was young, started to develop seizures. And when he got into his 20s, they were debilitating grand mal seizures, the most serious seizures that you could have, and he was having them multiple times a day. And even back then, in the 1950s, the treatment for it in severe cases that didn't respond to pharmacological interventions, didn't respond to drugs, was to remove one hippocampus, because in addition to be important for memory, the hippocampus, unfortunately, is very susceptible to be the generation point of new seizures. Mm-hmm. And so the idea was that they'd figure out which hippocampus was generating most of the seizures, and they'd remove that one hippocampus, and then these patients that were suffering from seizures would get much better. Well, Henry had such severe seizures, and they couldn't figure out which hippocampus was the major culprit. And so they decided to do an experimental procedure where they took out, this was a surgical lesion or damage, and they decided to remove both hippocampi because his seizures were most so severe. So the good news was that this surgical intervention significantly decreased the severity of his seizures. But the terrible and really the tragic news was that once he woke up from his operation, he was no longer able to form any new long-term memories. He couldn't remember any of the nurses that were taking care of him in the hospital, and he had a long hospital stay. He couldn't remember his doctors. Yet he remembered his parents. He remembered his childhood home. He knew how to get around his home. He remembered growing up and his childhood friends. But after the age of 27, when he had this operation, he was no longer able to form any new long-term memories. And the neurosurgeon, together with a very famous neuropsychologist, Brenda Milner, studied him and was able to pull out this key understanding that we didn't have before patient HM, that the hippocampus and the surrounding area was critical for our ability to form new long-term memories, but wasn't important for all forms of memory, only memory for facts and events, memories for facts and events. And that was really the start of the modern study of long-term memory formation and the role of the hippocampus in this critical cognitive function.
And those results are key to developing therapies for Alzheimer's, episodic memory deficits, some important things, right? So.
Absolutely. You need to understand how this region of the brain works normally before you can go in and intervene in a disease like Alzheimer's that starts to damage first structures, the major input structure of the hippocampus called the entorhinal cortex. That's actually the structure that gets damaged first. But then the Alzheimer's disease goes and attacks the cells of the hippocampus itself. Mm-hmm.
I do want to look at how you've applied all this knowledge to your life, because I think this autobiography you have going on here is in the context of the book is really interesting, and I was particularly struck by your work to improve relationships with your family, with a doorman, with a lab assistant, RA.
Yes.
So if we could touch on those a little bit, I think that would be useful to our listeners as well.
Sure. There were a lot of changes that took place. So, I mean, the background of the story was that I found myself completely unbalanced, focusing on work way too much. And, I had a very active and vibrant research lab, but I had no social life at all. And I was also 20 pounds overweight, and not working my body in the same way that I was working my brain to study the brain at that time. And so the first thing I did is I went and I started to go to the gym, because I didn't really know how to fix my social life, but I did know how to lose weight, and I went to the gym, and that actually had so many repercussions. Just getting out of the lab, I had many more interactions with non-science people in the gym. I started making friends there. I certainly got into shape over several years, and that's when I started to notice these changes that were happening because of exercise in my own brain. My mood was better, my attention was better, my memory was better. But I still had these issues about my social life. I started to make new friends, and this is when I went to a life coach, and I said, well, I've helped my brain with exercise as much as I can. I have a great exercise program. Maybe you can give me some kind of life coaching tips to help to enhance the social aspect of my life, which wasn't where I wanted it to be. Not as many kind of social connections as I wanted, and also strained relationships, even with the people in my lab. And so I'll just give you one example of how that work with the life coach and just this transformation I was going through played out. And this had to do with a conversation that I had with my doorman. Speaking of doorman again, my doorman, who probably recognizes more people than I do. Mm-hmm. And I had, right when I moved into my apartment in New York, I had a conversation with this doorman, and it didn't go very well. I asked for, a particular time for movers to come in, and I felt he was a little bit rude to me, or not particularly rude. Maybe that's too strong a word. Just unfriendly. But it was noticeable because all the other doormen in my building are so extra friendly, and he was not that way, not exuberant, and a little bit cold. And I got it in my head that he didn't like me. And so it went on, and he didn't seem as friendly to me. He seemed friendlier to other people, and I decided he just didn't like me. And so that next Christmas, or that first Christmas, I decided, you know what, it's unpleasant to work with him, and so I didn't give him a tip at Christmas, which is a terrible thing to do. Mm-hmm. And I talked to my life coach about this, and I said, I felt bad. I didn't know what was going on. And she said, did you talk to him about it? And I said, no. And she said, well, maybe you should have a conversation about the fact that you think he doesn't like you, and try and work it out. And I said, I don't know if I could have that conversation. It's very awkward. I have to admit to him that I think he doesn't like me. And she said, yeah, that's exactly what you need to do if you really want to clear this up. And the kind of motivation was the next Christmas had crept up on me, and I was feeling so guilty about not giving him a tip the next year, and still being in this limbo. I decided, okay, I had to actually have this conversation. So she helped me through, and she told me basically what I had to say. But I did not want to have this conversation. And I gave myself an ultimatum. In fact, the coach gave me an ultimatum. You had to get it done by this period of time. So I chose a day that I knew he was working. I remember sitting in my bedroom going over a script that I had actually written out and typed up so I'd know exactly what to say. And I couldn't help it. I had to pass him anyway because I had to go to work, so I had to see him anyway. So I went down and just prayed that there was nobody else talking to him. And wouldn't you know, the door opened and he was all alone. So I went up to him and I said, hi. Christmas is coming up, and I wanted to say that I think the entire door staff does such a great job here. But I wanted to kind of talk to you because I felt bad because of the fact that last year I didn't give you a tip. And I wanted to explain that the reason why I didn't give you a tip is I have the idea that you don't like me. And I say it easily now, but that was actually very difficult for me to choke out to him.
Sure.
And what he looked stunned that I was saying this to him, but then he processed the words and he said, "No, I don't have anything against you." And he said, "There's a lot of doormen in this building that are he feels overly friendly and wants to, talk about, your business. And he says he tries to be more professional, and in his mind that is professional, and he has nothing against me. And I said, oh, well, that is so good to know. I'm so glad we cleared this up, and I look forward to giving you a tip this Christmas, and I'm so glad we had this conversation. And by this point, I was starting to get very nervous and uncomfortable again. And I said, thank you very much, and I ran out of the building. And I was this was a difficult conversation to have, even though it came out positive. And I was almost crying with relief that it was over when I was running down the street trying to get away and going to the subway. But I have to say that conversation changed everything. It changed my attitude towards him, his attitude towards me. We were much more friendly, it shifted everything. And it was all because I admitted the fact that I had basically made up this story in my head that he didn't like me. And I went with it for over a year. Mm-hmm. And I don't think I'm the only one that does this.
Right.
And
exactly.
But I think few people actually go to the trouble of having the conversation with the person that you've decided doesn't like you. And I did. And it was a part of a cleanup process that I was going through in my life. That's all described in the book. Yeah. But I think people can relate, because there are always these people that you don't know. You can't even remember why you're not getting along or you don't like this person. But there's no reason for that. And that my coach made me realize this was causing weekly stress. Every single time he was down there and manning the door, I had to go past him with this feeling that I don't like you, and I don't even know why I like you, but I don't care. This is my attitude.
Right.
Instead of the attitude I ended up with, which is, thank you for listening to my confession, and I'm so glad that we can get along in the way that we do now. So,
I think that's an excellent example of a book that is so useful not only to better understand the brain, but also a kind of a self-help autobiography in so many ways. And there's so much we haven't touched on, the effect of exercise and meditation on brain health and controlling addictions. My favorite gem is the dismantling of the myth that we only use 10% of our brain, or that the right brain is the only place where creativity is. This is a book that is so rich with information and so helpful that I'm really glad we got the opportunity to interview, and I'm sorry we're out of time.
Okay, no, I understand. Thank you so much.
We've been talking to Dr. Wendy Suzuki, author of Healthy Brain, Happy Life, a personal program to activate your brain and do everything better. It's a great read, and I recommend it strongly. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. Remember, if you don't hear our program in its regular broadcast time, we're also on YouTube at Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook. Thanks for listening.